If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're in hour number 2, this live broadcast. Thank you for rejoining us, and we're going to go into deep politics right now. I want to welcome onto the show an excellent investigative journalist, Kit Klarenberg, who writes for a number of publications, including the Grayzone. We also will show his Substack column later, and we'll put that up on screen as well. Want to follow his work and on social media as well. Kit, welcome to the program.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going okay. There's a lot going on. I don't know where to start, but I want to get your take on a couple of situations. I know that you've been covering and writing about a lot of these sort of flashpoints right now. I mean, let's start with the situation in Palestine, Kit, because I think that's a real focal point right now for global politics. I want to talk about the role that the U.S. and the U.K. are playing, European countries are playing in this, and what do you see in terms of, is there any resolution on the horizon? Go ahead, Kit.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that, as grindingly, egregiously awful as it has been to watch on a minutely basis, like the genocide unfolding in Gaza. I joked the other day, although I was only half joking, about how my current daily routine is wake up, log into Twitter, be confronted with photos of dead or mutilated Palestinian children, and want to kill myself. I mean, it is difficult, but I think that there is a major global sea change in perceptions afoot. A large number of Europeans who drank the Kool-Aid in terms of believing that the proxy war in Ukraine was about defending sovereignty and democracy and liberty from fascistic barbarians at the gate, are now wondering what the hell they were supporting, given the same officials in Brussels and Washington and London and other key imperial centers of power are now cheering and encouraging and facilitating far worse crimes against humanity than Russia has committed in almost 2 years of war in Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen, almost a year to the day that she called Russian attacks on electricity infrastructure in Ukraine a horrendous crime against humanity and terrorism, is cheering Israel shutting off Gaza's access to electricity, and yes, encouraging them to do this and go further. So, I mean, there is a revolutionary fervor in the air. There have been massive protests all over Europe and the US, which have gotten zero media coverage. People are shocked and appalled by this. It is we've been constantly told never again. It's happening again. This is a 21st century Holocaust. Innocent people are dying in vast numbers. And all of the same people who preached about human rights and democracy and are now utterly silent, if not actively cheering this genocide being carried out. In response, there has been a massive effort by Western governments to crack down on freedom of speech, on dissent. There has been mass censorship. I gather that Elon Musk is, now currently visiting the Auschwitz Memorial at the express behest of the Israeli lobby. I've found that at the start of this, a number of my posts on Twitter went viral about the genocide. Now I'm being throttled quite considerably. So there is a major backlash. Whether it will be effective is less than certain. And I think that if nothing else, the incredible resolve and indefatigability of the Palestinian people, the fact that they can still remain somehow optimistic that a better tomorrow is potential, if not likely, is really quite extraordinary. And I think that people should take, people who are finding this quite difficult and unpleasant to follow should take some solace from that and some inspiration from it. The same with Yemen. We see a country that has been bombed genocidally by a Saudi-led Air Force coalition for almost a decade, where they targeted weddings and funerals and religious gatherings and fields and fishing boats to try and starve the population. They didn't yield. They didn't back down, and now they're continuing to refuse to back down. And they seem to have, on multiple occasions, inflicted completely flawless defeats on the US empire without firing a shot. So, yes, there is much cause for woe, but much cause for optimism as well, I think.
I want to talk about Yemen because the
Sure.
geopolitical implications of this are huge. But before we do that, you mentioned something just now, Kit, I think is really key. You work in the information space. You're on the front lines of, you could say, the information war as a journalist. And when the publications you're writing for, including the Grayzone, definitely on the front lines of a lot of these issues. So you talked about how this has played out because you remember you're browbeaten for any dissent on Ukraine when that situation kind of reemerged in late February 2022. Anybody with a dissenting opinion, suspect, potential Russian agents, browbeaten politically, and then accused of undermining confidence in Western governments and the mainstream media even. And look at what's happening with this policy in Gaza. I mean, I can't think of anything that's undermining people's confidence in government than backing Israel still after 3 months. I don't see anyone calling for a ceasefire. And the media are basically acting as a kind of surrogate for the Israeli government. So this is like 10x worse than Ukraine, if you think about it, in terms of the blowback potential on this. Just your view of the information space and how governments, mainstream media are interacting with the public on this.
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing a massive and indeed unprecedented backlash against mainstream Western narratives on social media. So, for instance, to name but one example, Germany, because it is supporting Israel in South Africa's effort to hold Israel to account for genocide in the International Court of Justice, they submitted a lengthy, detailed, and really quite perverse set of legal arguments for why it was okay for Israel to kill unarmed, innocent children with impunity in Gaza. And they used the argument that, well, as victims of a past genocide, the residents of Israel cannot be held accountable if they try and defend themselves in this way. I mean, I saw a large number of Africans on Twitter make the obvious point that, if that's the precedent, then, well, we have had genocides inflicted upon us upon European powers. That means it's okay for us to start massacring Germans and Belgians and French and British citizens with total impunity. You know, like people are waking up to this. And the only response that imperial powers have is to just ignore them and pretend they don't exist. And I think that, I mean, that's a balancing act that can only be conducted so far. Again, to bring this back to Yemen, Joe Biden was recently asked whether the airstrikes that were carried out completely illegally and without parliamentary or congressional approval on Yemen by Britain and the US were succeeding, whether they were effective. And Biden, kind of in his usual mumbling manner, said, well, no, but they're going to continue. Like, I mean, that's all the empire knows how to do is just carry on as normal and pretend this isn't happening. The reality on the ground, there are all sorts of disjunctures and flashpoints that power is really not waking up to because they can't admit it. I mean, you mentioned Ukraine. That is a huge defeat for NATO, for Western powers. They threw everything, including the kitchen sink, at Russia. We were told multiple times at the start of this that, oh, well, the sanctions are going to crush Russia's economy. And actually, they've bounced back better than ever. Like, you know, the internal investment is at record levels. Unemployment is at record lows. And they are amply demonstrated to the world that actually holding your money in Western banks is a very bad thing because due to the political wills of supposedly elected leaders, they can just seize it if they want. I mean, it's piracy. We are seeing a record amount of international transactions in trade being conducted in non-dollar currencies, which is a huge seismic development, which is not being faced up to by Western powers. And so, yeah, like, I mean, I think that there is a kind of, we're the emperor's new clothes stage of the empire, where the US is just continuing to pretend that it is a completely invincible, unparalleled global hegemon with the right and the power to govern the entire world, and much of the world is just continuing as if they don't exist. And on a personal level, people are doing this. People are doing this too. I'm seeing an enormous amount of pro-Palestinian protests in the UK and Amsterdam and Berlin, where people are holding signs saying "Thank you, Yemen." I mean, the US recently just designated the entirety of Yemen as a terrorist group. I mean, it's a country, you know, but people don't care. I mean, Yemenis don't care. They're now boastfully saying, you know, "My dear fellow terrorists," when they address each other. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very, very interesting time, and in many ways an exciting time to be alive. It is a pity this is coming off the back of so many deaths and so much destruction. But yeah, I mean, again, like, you know, like causes for optimism. There was a quite an interesting. I think it was the Wall Street Journal. I'm not sure. It was a major liberal publication that recently it reported on how European officials were well aware that by supporting the Israeli genocide in Gaza, that they were destroying any hope of winning hearts and minds in the global south. I mean, I think that is a recognition that they knew they'd already lost. And so it's an you can't fire me, I quit type situation, where they're claiming to somehow still maintain the moral high ground, even if, you know, nobody agrees and nobody cares. We've seen recently Tunisia hand back tens of millions in EU aid because they said they didn't want it because there were too many strings attached. Yeah, this is a period of major unrest. And I made this point on Twitter earlier today. The US's strategy for dealing with the Houthis, because they have suggested that they will launch a ground invasion of Yemen, which is just completely insane, and will create yet another unwinnable quagmire in which lots of US citizens will be killed because they're serving with the US military. The US officials admitted to Politico very quietly that their strategy in the Red Sea was just wait for China to step in. Which, of course, I mean, you know, the US has almost overnight been reduced to the status of Britain, just this kind of chihuahua yapping and hoping that someone bigger and richer and stronger will come to their rescue. But the reality is that Chinese ships are not being harassed in the Red Sea because they opposed the Israeli genocide. Right, so China's not going to come to the US's rescue, and the US has run out of options. Like I said, with much fanfare, Washington announced a 7-nation naval flotilla that was going to go and bop Yemen under the rather bizarre name Operation Prosperity Guardian. And then it collapsed before it was even launched. Multiple countries said, actually, we want nothing to do with this. The UK, because of course, still clinging on for dear life to the empire's coattails, said that they were still signed up to it. And then they quietly conceded they were having to decommission frigates because they have so few staff. And then in a really amazing incident on the 18th of January, on the coast of Bahrain, 2 of their major ships smashed into each other. So, I mean, again, without a shot being fired, flawless victories over the empire.
No, it is incredible. All the things that you mentioned with going back to sanctions that have pushed people out of the US dollar, pushed Russia towards China, having the world looking east, having the global south looking east, 2 big players emerge. South Africa as a moral voice on the world stage when no one else did. Yemen emerging as the only one who's willing to sanction Israel and back it up with hard power. So are we seeing a multipolar, that multipolar world that everybody's talking about? Are we actually seeing this emerge right now? Or is this the sort of birth pangs of a multipolar world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is absolutely the birth pains of a multipolar world. I mean, you could even go back to January 2022, where Russia signed a agreement of friendship with China. Now, the terms are really quite extraordinary, and they're worth poring over now. It stated that the relationship between Russia and China knows no bounds. There is going to be cooperation between these two nations in every conceivable economic and political sphere. And then all sorts of other small but seismic developments, such as China stating that they were going to start teaching Russian in Chinese schools. Automatically, almost overnight, that's a billion new Russian speakers in the world. And then, fast forward to today, and you hear US leaders, one of the arguments for ending the proxy war in Ukraine is it's pushing Russia and China too close together, and they want to stop that. Talk about like trying to close the stable door long after the horse has bolted. We are living in a world where the people who claim to rule us absolutely are not in control anywhere apart from in their own minds. As I say, it's an exciting time to be alive. I think we shouldn't be surprised if we are very surprised by what happens next. I mean, I'm sitting in a country now that was destroyed criminally and brazenly by NATO almost 25 years ago. We're coming up to the 25th anniversary. It was based entirely on lies. It was done with total impunity. NATO committed war crimes like deliberately targeting civilian homes and schools and hospitals. And they sold this as a major moral victory. People here live with the legacy of that to this day. But when Odessa, I'm absolutely convinced that probably in the next few months, actually, we're going to see a major Russian move to seize territory like Odessa and Kharkiv, which are traditionally Russian oblast within Ukraine, which were given to what was then a component of the Soviet Union known as Ukraine by successive Soviet leaders. And then that links Serbia with the Black Sea via the Danube, and it links it with Russia. Now there is a major US military base on Serbian territory known as Camp Bondsteel, which was constructed in Kosovo after the illegal bombing, and it supported the creation of an illegitimate narco-terrorist state in Kosovo, which unilaterally declared independence in 2008. Automatically, again, overnight, Russia then has Bondsteel on its doorstep by token of being connected with Serbia with the Danube. It may well have a problem with this. This is an issue which is now going to be resolved. So, Trotsky, as much as I loathe the guy, had a quote which was, war is what oils the wheels of history. If we think back to 3 years ago or even 2 years ago to this day, the fact that the notion that Israel would be engaged in a total war with Hamas, and not only that, but like losing badly. Like we're seeing videos all the time. But like today, it was announced that the IDF was setting explosive charges in I think it was a school in Gaza, and then Hamas rocket struck them, killing 21 Israeli soldiers. And meanwhile, Israel is depopulating rapidly. People are fleeing. Psychiatrists are leaving Israel because they're finding the work of dealing with PTSD ravaged Israeli occupation force soldiers too difficult. And this seems kind of inconceivable. All of 2 years ago, the notion that Russia was going to be dictating terms to the West in terms of what it was going to do in Ukraine, what territory it was going to keep, was kind of inconceivable. But here we are. There's another phrase which is gradually then rapidly. I would see the first year or so of the war in Ukraine as the gradual part, and now we're into the rapid part, and who knows where we're going to end up.
It's interesting, you're talking about the decline of the U.S. As an imperial power, as a kind of unipolar hegemon, with Britain there at its side. Of course, it's Britain's the brains, America's the muscle. But with the decline, we'll get to that in a minute. With the decline of the U.S., though, where Israel used to be regarded as the tail wagging the U.S. imperial dog, Israel's becoming more like a ball and chain at the moment, because as the U.S. goes down, Israel goes down with it, and its clout diminishes substantially. Where else can Israel go for sponsorship and protection and subsidies? And I don't see Europe as a natural sponsor of Israel. They might try. I don't see anyone in Asia. Don't see anyone in Africa. This is just, I think we're looking at a potential tectonic shift here in the Middle East. What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The timings are quite interesting on this. So, I mean, the end of World War II in 1945 marked the beginning of a global Pax Americana, really. And a core component of that has been the existence of the State of Israel. It is a completely illegitimate colonial settler project. Its realities have been obscured from Western populations for decades. Now we are seeing in brutal detail what this implies, which is a genocide that occurs at differing speeds depending on Israel's interest at a particular time. Netanyahu the other day very boastfully admitted that he was going to just whatever the Hague, the ICJ said about Israel's conduct in the occupied territories, it was just going to keep going. And so, therefore, the entire credibility and legitimacy of the ICJ, which is supposedly an international force for justice, although, of course, the US is not only not signed up to it, but has a piece of legislation called the Hague Invasion Act, which in the event that US officials or soldiers or generals are held account for war crimes, the US will invade the Hague. Again, the hypocrisy couldn't be writ larger. The empire and its lackeys, including, yes, Britain and particularly Israel, have painted themselves into corners. It's interesting watching Israel flail and desperately attempting to try and gain a foothold in the information war, which it has been losing desperately since the very start of this. I mean, doing desperate things like shuttling in Jerry Seinfeld to Israel so he can be pictured, eating a falafel. And this is meant to boost their PR. Like, people can see with their own eyes, what's happening. But not only that, it also raises wider questions for a lot of people about what the hell Israel has been doing to Palestinians since 1948. I mean, the perfect example. There was an incident where there were some Israeli hostages who were waving a white flag, shirtless, and speaking Hebrew. And the Israeli occupation forces slaughtered them. And then this raises all sorts of historical precedents where Israel has a history of murdering unarmed Palestinians who are waving white flags, and they're clearly no threat. This is blasting past crimes and misdemeanors onto headlines and computer and phone screens, the world over. It's impossible to have sympathy in that context for such a rotten, mephitic structure. The only response of power across the West is just straight up censorship. France was going it was desperately trying to pass legislation that would criminalize anti-Zionist political activism and writing on a par with anti-Semitism. It was due to massive public pressure this was dropped. Germany has legalized the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And there are all sorts of utterly vile statements made by German officials about Muslims and about in general and Palestinians in particular, and openly stating that they deserve collective punishment due to the purported crimes of Hamas. And in Britain, we've just had in December, serendipitously enough, a bit of legislation called the National Security Act, which is full of Orwellian kind of thought crime-esque prohibitions and is so utterly vague that I do wonder on a daily basis whether I've just committed a crime by accident, by token of my writing. It states that, well, someone can be working for a foreign power and furthering a foreign power's interests in a criminal way without them knowing or intending to, or without the foreign power on whose behalf they are operating even knowing. That's crazy. And I made this point last summer in interviews with no to war, no to NATO, that like this is going to be a pretext for people getting jailed for expressing the wrong opinions on social media because the British government has decided that suggesting there is a genocide going on in Gaza is Russian disinformation. Therefore, like you've committed a crime. It's really quite frightening. I feel extremely privileged to be in safe, neutral Serbia, which is staying well clear of all of these conflicts.
No, it is pretty extraordinary that if your views or your writings aren't aligned with British foreign policy, for instance, which, let's be frank, and not very successful. Look at the things that they've backed over the years. I mean, so if you're calling balls and strikes, you're like, this is going to be a disaster, or you're acknowledging the fact that the Yemenis are being extremely effective and also acting as a deterrent against greater powers, that's somehow undermining confidence in the rules-based international order, the British foreign policy. It's utterly ridiculous. Tony Benn would be like rolling in his grave right now, as would
sure
many other. And many other British journalists, dead and alive. So it is extraordinary, but I think it's this seems like a real acts of desperation to control narratives that clearly cannot be controlled. And it's almost like they're spinning their wheels on this. No, let's talk about war crimes now. The United States and Britain are not neutral observers of the situation in Gaza. Okay, they're active participants. I would even say, some might say, Kit, co-belligerents in what's happening in Gaza. They're providing arms, material support. More than that, I think there was a report, Kit, of a British drone that was flying over Gaza as the incursions on Khan Yunis refugee camp are taking place this week. I mean, what are the profound implications of this? Because what happens if a case comes against the U.S. or the UK? Let's just talk about the UK. If they're found or accused of being guilty, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that, it's very important to talk about Britain in this context because, we hear an awful lot about US double standards on the Biden administration, on the one hand, claiming that they're trying to rein in Israel's barbarity, and then on the other, just sending them bombs to just carry on doing this. And it's good that we're hearing about this. And I think Britain's role is worthy of much greater attention. I wrote something on my Substack about this a few weeks back. The Britain's SAS is almost undoubtedly directly involved in the genocide, right? The SAS, the Special Air Service, this is an elite British Special Forces unit that seems to somehow end up on site for many massacres. They were on the ground in Srebrenica in Bosnia, serendipitously, when allegedly the Bosnian Serbs carried out a genocide of unarmed Bosniak males there. They were somehow in Waco when the ATF massacred the people. They get everywhere. They're like fleas. And so I think it was at the end of last year that there is a very shadowy and little known British government run body called the DSMA Committee, the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee. And this is run by the Ministry of Defence. It has representatives of MI5 and MI6 and other British government agencies, covert and overt. And they meet with the heads of major newspapers and news outlets in the UK, and they dictate to them what matters related to national security can be reported on and how. National security is obviously a very broad brush. This could include British companies engaged in criminality and corruption and fraud abroad. This could be considered a national security matter because it would damage Britain's economic relationships or some rubbish like that. And yes, at the end of 2023, the DSMA wrote to the editors of major newspapers in Britain and said, please do not report on the activities of the SAS in and around Israel, with particular reference to quote unquote counter-terrorist operations. Now, reading between the lines, it's quite clear what they meant was like, don't you dare report on the presence of the SAS in Gaza. So the Britain is directly linked to war crimes in Gaza. It is directly linked to the genocide. There have been, I mean, in an absolutely remarkable case I reported on for the Grayzone, Britain has something called the Chevening Scholarship, which is a British Foreign Office program, which provides free education at elite British universities to individuals in all over the world. It's several people who are Chevening scholars have gone on to become heads of state in their respective home countries. It is regarded as this crown jewel of British diplomacy, and in leaked files I've reported on, they openly talk about using it to gain pro-British influences in various regions and countries of interest to London. Now, one of the Chevening scholars, who I think it was in 2022, was meeting with the British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and snapping grinning selfies with him, was murdered by Israel in airstrikes. He'd been messaging friends of his with whom he studied in I think King's College, which is an elite university in Britain, saying he was terrified of being crushed under rubble, and then he was. And his family members were killed by Israeli snipers when they went to try and rescue him. And this caused a major outcry. And James Cleverly was asked about this, and his response was something to the effect of, "Oh, well, it's sad when anyone dies." This is an absolute nightmare for them. And the only response is censorship, criminalization of dissenting opinions, several British citizens who've expressed solidarity with Hamas, or at least solidarity with Palestinians against the Israeli genocide, have found themselves in court over counter-terror charges. Craig Murray is now seeking asylum in Switzerland. He's a former British diplomat turned whistleblower and dissident, a tremendous independent journalist. He is now in hiding in Switzerland because he's under investigation for terrorism offences. I myself, at least based on my last interactions with British police, am under criminal investigation for the high crime of investigative journalism. It's brute force is the only response that power has.
No, it is incredible, and again, underscored by, let's look at the policies. Look at the backing of Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine. 2 years. It can't be objectively measured as a success on any level, and Britain's deeply involved in this conflict. In fact, they're leading this sort of kiboshing all the diplomatic initiatives to get peace from the beginning. They've got special forces on the ground. They've got mercenaries in there. They're providing technical support. Who knows what else for attacks on the Sevastopol Russian Black Sea Fleet base and so forth, the Kerch Strait Bridge, all of that. They're so deeply involved in it, and I can't see it as being a success. So what is the success? Is the success, Kit, just being involved, just being in the action, selling weapon systems? How does the government define success?
No, well, I think from the US government's perspective, that their measure of success is, do our weapons firms make enormous amounts of money? And I think, they're winning there. Certainly, this is a huge victory for Raytheon and other major defense contractors. But I think from Britain's perspective, that since World War II, they have been obsessed with maintaining the American empire in order to try and shift it in directions that serve its own interests. And Britain is well aware that its international clout and power and to a large extent wealth depends on the US empire existing. Therefore, they are very, 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 very keen and heavily invested in maintaining that relationship, if you can call it that. It entails conning the US or manipulating US officials into doing their bidding. They're not always successful. And I think that in Ukraine, I've reported on this extensively. There was an organization called Integrity Initiative, which was a British intelligence black propaganda operation, which on its own website in 2014 published an article which basically stated that the way that we have to deal with Russia is to diplomatically and economically isolate the country and through demonize Russia internationally, damage its political relationships. This will inevitably lead to war of the old-fashioned sort, quote unquote, which the West and Britain will win. Integrity Initiative then went about doing that and ensuring there could be no diplomatic settlement in Ukraine, over the Donbass and the Minsk Accords, which Zelensky was elected on an overwhelming, landslide majority to implement, and then did nothing because he was frightened of the far right influences in Ukraine, which are heavily sponsored and funded and armed and trained by Britain and America, of course. And so, it was hoped by Britain that, this proxy war with Russia would lead to all-out US involvement and, kind of a hot war with soldiers on the ground, in Western soldiers on the ground in Russia. That hasn't come to pass. And actually, it is a major, major defeat that cannot be admitted. And so in that context, I think that Britain is probably extremely dangerous now. It is trying to provoke and incite major global conflicts to stay relevant. Again, here in the Balkans, there is an enormous fear that many people have of Britain stoking war. The place is already crawling with British, quote unquote, peacekeepers who are allegedly there to guard against Russian aggression. Whose soldiers have invaded here? It's not Russia's, it's Britain's. They are also heavily involved in Gaza. And there was this amazing Robert Peston, who is this kind of establishment client journalist of some standing. On October 8th, like less than, I think it was maybe less, or only a little bit more than 24 hours after Operation Al-Aqsa flood started and Hamas infiltrated Israel and started taking hostages and taking out Israeli occupation force bases. Robert Peston stated that based on British intelligence sources, that he was certain that this was the start of a major regional war that's going to have implications for much of the world. How did they know at such an early stage unless that's what they were planning for and wanted to happen?
No, absolutely. And just on this subject, we've got a couple of minutes left. The Balkans. Yeah. Now, a lot of people will view, in the West anyway, will view the Balkans as let's say, a foothold for NATO to disrupt, to destabilize. Kosovo is there, as you mentioned. That's more or less a protectorate of the West. And so Britain and the US, NATO, to maybe interrupt what Russia wants to do in terms of their military objectives, their national security objectives vis-a-vis Ukraine. What is the sense in the Balkans of this possibility? I know that there's a lot going on politically, domestically, but then the situation in Kosovo has kind of flared up this year. Or have people learned their lessons of the past and they're not going to go for the bait that's going to be laid by the West on that? What do you think, Kit?
Well, I think that, Serbs are, my people, but they are very, very wary. They are choosing the hills they die on very, very carefully because they know that the numerous traps are being set up for them to fall into, because they are well aware that the slightest hint of trouble will be exploited in order to occupy them, bomb them, foment regime change. We saw this at the end of last year, that there were these very pathetic, very small scale opposition protests following the election because the liberal opposition, who most Serbs hate, lost, and they were trying to rationalize their defeat, and they claimed that there was widespread fraud that only affected them and not any other political party, and they weren't able to prove it, and in the end they were told to go home quite unambiguously by the US ambassador here, Christopher Hill, who's like the real ruler of Serbia. And there was a flurry of Western media attention on this, and there was the liberal media like the Guardian saying that the EU should take action against Serbia. This just turns people further away from Europe, and so I think that there is this sense of that we're kind of potentially hurtling towards conflict, but people, if the time comes to fight, people will fight, but they are very wary of doing so now because they don't want to walk into a trap And yes, the West has been baiting them. There is a particular bête noire of mine. She's a British parliamentarian called Alicia Kearns, who she's a former British intelligence officer of some standing. I mean, she's been stirring up trouble here and referring to the Balkans as Britain's backyard, and she's horrific, colonialist language. And she has been calling for firm action against Serbia and for Britain beefing up its military presence in Bosnia and Kosovo and other kind of other flashpoints. Again, they are throwing lit matches into a powder keg in the desperate hope that something erupts. To date, nothing has. I credit the Serb public with a lot more wisdom and sense and patience than to fall for this.
Yeah, and it is also interesting with the development of the situation in Ukraine has the juxtaposition of the legitimate autonomy of Crimea, for instance, versus Kosovo. That's a debate nobody in the West really wants to engage in, among other similar state-led debates. But and as well, Kit, the situation in Israel, as horrific as it's been, it's also really put things into perspective for people, like you said, how they're viewing the Ukrainian conflict versus what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. And you're seeing real war crimes. You're seeing a real genocide take place. That's putting a lot of people on the spot, especially Western leaders, political leaders, been grandstanding for years, using demagoguery and all sorts of tropes against Russia, but yet they're silent on Israel. And everybody sees it, Kit. I think the average man on the street, you see the numbers on the street. It's absolutely incredible. So I agree with you. We are seeing a sea change on multiple levels. So very interesting times indeed. But give a shout out as well, Kit, to where people can find your work and on social media.
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Twitter. It's just Kit Klarenberg, as you mentioned. I have a Substack, which is kitklarenberg.substack.com. I'm a regular contributor to the Grayzone. I run the Grayzone UK, which is looking at the Britain's role as America's lapdog in chief. But I also contribute to the Cradle and Min Press regularly. So you can find me on all of these platforms.
Yeah, those are all some of the best publications out there. Big shout out to the Cradle as well. It's emerged as one of the best Middle East focused online journals. Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Kit Klarenberg, we really appreciate you joining us on TNT this week. Be safe and look forward to seeing more of your work in future.
God bless you. Take care, Patrick.